Thank you for that lovely introduction, Carrie. Thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. I know that it is not required to be a Southern voice in order to speak at this festival. I actually am a Southern writer. I'm a native of Atlanta, which is something that often gets kind of washed out of my biography. Even if I were from Baltimore, I would still be a native of the South because Baltimore is below the Mason-Dixon line. I am the one who says of my beloved hometown that it has the pace of the South and the manners of the North. So that's Baltimore. But I actually have a connection to Alabama. My paternal great-grandfather, Ike Lippman, came to Alabama after a series of migrations. He left what we believe was probably now Lithuania, maybe, who knows, came to the United States, came in probably through the Port of New York, tried Albany, tried Maryland, and ended up in Montgomery, Alabama, where he and my great-grandmother had a small fruit stand. My grandfather was the only one of the children born in this country, and he would become the first Jewish insurance salesman for the Travelers Company, ending up marrying into a family from Georgia. And my father was completely baffled by the idea that he might even be considered Jewish, but his uncle's name is on the synagogue wall down in Montgomery. So I am a Southern writer. And what I'm going to do tonight is something a little bit different. Y'all have given me such a lovely amount of time to talk. I'm going to combine a reading and a talk. And the reading is from a book I have coming out in May called My Life is a Villainess. And it's autobiographical. It's a series of essays. Some of them have appeared on the internet, but most of them are new. This one is certainly new. And I chose to read it because it tells you something about how this all began. You know, Ted Baxter on the old Mary Tyler Moore show is always like, it all began at a 15,000 watt rate. So my story has always been, it all began when I got on a Greyhound bus to go to Waco, Texas. And this story is not only the story of my beginnings as a writer, as a person making her career as a writer, which is what I've done since I was 22 years old, but also the beginning of everything. And it is called The Waco Kid. People sometimes ask how I ended up in Waco, Texas for my first job out of college. I don't like to brag, but it was the result of a careful, methodical campaign in which I spent 6 months trying to find a newspaper gig in New England. I graduated from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism in 1981. The economy was not in great shape in general, and journalism jobs in particular were hard to find. And although Medill had cheerfully taken my parents' cash money for 4 years, its placement office had no interest in placing me anywhere, except perhaps a 5th year in Medill. The school's official line was that the journalism education wasn't complete unless one stayed for graduate school. I wanted out. I loved Northwestern, but Medill was a snake pit, a cruel place that reveled in its cruelty. The faculty claimed it was preparing us for the real world, which they swore would be far worse, assuming we could even find a foothold there. Post-Watergate, we were told, there were so many would-be reporters in the country's journalism schools that if every single working journalist died the next day, there still wouldn't be enough jobs for all of us. And that was day one at orientation. It only got worse from there. By my senior year, I felt as if I had spent 4 years running a gauntlet of mean old white men. There was one outstanding exception, Sally Gaines, a Chicago Tribune copy editor who treated her students with love and respect. In the early 1980s, applying for newspaper jobs, absent a connection, meant sending a cover letter, resume, and clips to managing editors. My father was in the business, but I had shockingly few connections. An editor at the Chicago Sun-Times agreed to see me, but he had no encouraging words. Chicago Tribune columnist Bob Greene suggested we meet for lunch and talk about my future. Surprise, surprise, lunch was switched to dinner, and he wasn't interested in my future beyond that evening. I walked out. Meanwhile, all those letters to New England towns, Fall River, Bedford, Bennington, Manchester, Plymouth, Salem, they all went unacknowledged. I had one tiny ace up my sleeve, an internship I had completed at the Atlanta Constitution, the biggest newspaper in the Cox chain. My Atlanta supervisor told me that one of the Cox sister papers, the Waco Tribune-Herald, was looking for reporters, and its editor-in-chief had worked in Atlanta. He'd put in a good word for me. The Tribune-Herald's interest was gratifyingly immediate. I looked good on paper, I was told. The problem was my paper profile wasn't sufficient. They didn't hire without a face-to-face interview, and they didn't pay anyone's travel expenses for such interviews. I took a 28-hour Greyhound bus from Chicago to Waco, changing twice in St. Louis and Dallas. I left Chicago on Wednesday afternoon, arrived in Waco after dark on Thursday. I went to the only motel within walking distance of the bus station. It was exactly what you would expect from a motel within walking distance of the Greyhound bus station in Waco, Texas. On Friday, I was interviewed by 4 editors, all white men, at least 3 of whom told me that Waco was the buckle on the Bible Belt and a great place to raise a family. They offered me a job before I left. I told them I would like to think about it and got back on the bus. But I knew I was going to take the job. It was the only offer I had. My starting salary was $175 a week, not quite $500 in today's dollars. Back at Northwestern, my news photography instructor, Howard Finberg, mocked my gig, called me the Waco Kid, the name of the alcoholic sharpshooter that Gene Wilder plays in Blazing Saddles. My parents had paid thousands of dollars for me to go to Northwestern. Northwestern had done nothing to help me get a job, and now my instructor was making fun of the job I'd gotten on my own. That was Medill in a nutshell. That was why I had to get out. If that meant being the Waco Kid, so be it. So, what am I even doing in journalism school? Because I always wanted to be a novelist. Always, always. I wrote my first novel when I was 5. I didn't know how to read or write. I didn't see why that should hold me back. I sat down at my father's portable typewriter. He was a journalist. He had a little typewriter that he carried with him, and I sat and I just pounded the keys randomly. I knew one word. I had figured out the word pig, probably from 3 Little Pigs. I'd had that moment. So you'd see like extra little pig, little pig, and then I drew, and this would be just so politically incorrect now. It was about cavemen. And so I just drew these pictures of dinosaurs and cavemen, and there was probably, a woman being dragged by her hair. And I told people it's in caveman language. And my mother actually saved that little book, and I have it in a box frame above my desk to this day, my first book. I mean, the thing is that my dad was a journalist. I knew journalists. I knew that it was possible to go to work as a writer every day if you worked at a newspaper. I didn't know any novelists. I didn't know how someone became a novelist. I knew how people went to school, they got degrees in creative writing, they all seemed to end up teaching writing. And I was just like, well, I'll become a journalist, and at least then I'll be a writer. But all I ever wanted to be was a novelist. So newspapers were very much a fallback position for me. And that made it challenging at times. I arrived in Waco after 2 days on the road, driving a Ford Escort that was packed to the brim and had a fake woman known as Aunt B strapped into the front passenger seat. In her flowery dress and pink straw hat, she resembled the character on the Andy Griffith Show. The copy editor, when they got to this part, they go, "Why did you do this?" I'm like, "Because I was 22. I don't know. Why do you do anything?" I had rented my apartment via phone. It was a 1-bedroom in a complex that looked like a Motel 6, only not as nice. It had a burnt orange accent wall and cost $220 a month, more than a third of my take-home pay. I headed straight to Kmart to buy a few essentials. There was a coin-operated bucking bronco outside the Kmart, just like the ones I had ridden in my childhood. A little girl was struggling with it. My heart soared. How quaint, how lovely. Maybe I could be happy here. To the best of my memory, it was June 22nd, a Monday. On June 19th, at a park 2 counties over, there had been a huge Juneteenth celebration. Juneteenth marks the 1865 date when a Union officer arriving in Galveston brought news that the slaves were free. In 1891, Juneteenth was not well known outside Texas. A search of the New York Times database from 1885 through 1980 doesn't yield a single reference. At the celebration in Limestone County, 3 African-American teenagers were arrested for possession of marijuana and pills on an island in the Parks Lake. 3 deputies, 2 white, 1 black, decided to transport the young men by boat. The boat capsized 30 to 40 feet from shore. 2 deputies swam to safety. A third clung to the boat like a spider, according to one eyewitness. All 3 teenagers drowned. Given that the deaths happened late Friday, the story would have first been reported in the Waco Tribune-Herald on Sunday, June 21st. On Monday, it understandably continued to dominate page 1. I'm a Southern native who has spent enough time in the North to know that no region is free of bigotry. But this was a daunting introduction to my new town. That little girl outside Kmart was the only thing giving me hope. As I approached the store's front doors, I realized the girl was kicking the mechanical horse and screaming, "Give me back my money, you N-word." And it says in ... I'm going to say a terrible, terrible profanity before this piece is over, and I apologize in advance if that offends you, and I thought a lot about it, and it's a very rude word, and it's not a word I use normally, but when I get there, I think you'll agree that I've earned it. I think a lot about words, duh. And in the book of essays I have coming out, when I went through them recently, proofing them, I realized that at one point I argued 2 different things in 2 different essays. In one essay, I said, if you say something often enough, it has no meaning. I was like, it's an essay about being an older mom. And I just say, I'm old, I'm old, I'm old, I'm 60 with a 9-year-old, say it often enough, and it begins to have no meaning. And then another essay about body positivity, I say, if you say nice things over and over again, they will have meaning. And I will just say, in defense of that, I will cite F. Scott Fitzgerald, who said that the test of a first-rate intellect was to hold 2 opposing ideas in your mind without going insane, which is a test I think I've met. But I do think words matter. And I think, so I'm going to say this horrible profanity that I know is really not some people's bag. I was talking to the guy driving me to the airport today, and he was giving me a lecture on profanity among the young, and he didn't even know about my essay. I don't know how he was on to me. And I thought, well, what I would say is that I'm careful about words that actually hurt, which are personal words that take people down. So they're generic profanity that may be rude, but they're not intended to cause personal harm. And then they're words that are so cruel and so mean, they just shouldn't be said. And so I guess that's where I'm lining up in terms of how I feel about words. Waco is different now, aren't we all? Haven't we all grown and changed since 1981? When I got there, Waco was best known as the birthplace of Dr. Pepper and the home of Baylor University. In 1993, its reputation would become entwined with the deadly Branch Davidian standoff. The people who lived there would really like you to know that did not happen inside the town limits. And while Baylor has had quite the sexual assault scandal over the past few years, Waco is now Gainesville, as in Chip and Joanna Gaines, the married co-host of HGTV's Fixer Upper, which went off the air in 2018 but is still available through Hulu in endless repeats. This extremely wholesome show has spawned a sprawling empire for the Gaineses and a tourist boom for Waco. But Waco, which likes to call itself the heart of Texas, the heart of Central Texas, has a darkness it will never quite shake. New residents such as myself quickly learn about the 1953 tornado, one of the deadliest in Texas history. It struck downtown in the afternoon, killing 114 and injuring more than 600. 3 decades later, when I walked the sad pedestrian mall that had failed to revive Waco's downtown, the tornado was still the official town bogeyman. But I sensed others lurking. There was a particularly nasty triple murder in Waco when I lived there, one that was solved in a way that led to a lingering doubt and suspicion and almost cost a journalist his sanity. Meanwhile, the 3 officers charged with negligent homicide in the June 19th drowning were acquitted by an all-white jury in Dallas. In the 19th century, Waco was known for its lawlessness. William Copper Brand, editor of the Iconoclast newspaper, is said to have divided the community with his diatribes against Baylor and the Baptist. To be fair, he hated Episcopalians too. He was shot in the street on April 1st, 1898, and died of his injuries, but not before he managed to return fire and kill his assailant. Brand was such a divisive figure that his tombstone was vandalized repeatedly and then stolen outright in 2009. In the 20th century, the city sought to remake its image, shed its Wild West reputation, even as its county, McLennan, racked up a shockingly high number of lynchings, 15 overall, placing it second among Texas's 254 counties. One specific vigilante torture death by mob, there really are no synonyms for lynching, received so much attention that it's said to have helped turn public attention against the practice. W.E.B. Du Bois, then the head of the NAACP, devoted 8 pages to the 1916 death of Jesse Washington in the Crisis, a new magazine. The Waco Horror, as Du Bois dubbed it, sorry I pronounced that wrong before, is considered seminal in changing the tide of public opinion, at least on the editorial pages of faraway newspapers. To be clear, lynchings continued for almost another 70 years in the United States, and not just in the South. But the Waco Horror helped to change the conversation. No one ever spoke of the Waco Horror to me in the 2 years I lived there. The buckle on the Bible belt cinched its waist tight. And good luck to those who didn't fit. When I was in Waco, I often felt like Isadora Wing, the autobiographical heroine of Erica Jong's Fear of Flying, albeit with a much less robust sex life. In the novel, Wing is living in Germany, where her second husband is stationed as a military doctor in the 1960s. She finds books in the local library with pro-Nazi sentiments and photographs that have been papered over. When she tells her therapist about her discoveries, he asks her why she's so determined to publish an article about her findings. She says she's horrified by the hypocrisy. She wants to tell the truth. The truth, her psychiatrist says, is that many Germans loved Hitler. Does she want to hear that? Like Isadora Wing, I wanted to steam off the blank pages, expose Waco's darker side. I yearned to shock and provoke. A colleague and I wrote a piece about how 2 Yankees adjusted to life in Waco. Yankees in quote, I know I'm not one. Our editors were delighted with the hate mail it generated. As part of a film panel at Baylor, I described the Porky movies. How many people remember the Porky movies? An R-rated franchise about sex-crazed high school boys as, I'm sorry for this, it's a little bit risque, Andy Hardy with a hard-on, upsetting several co-eds who complained about my potty mouth. An anonymous caller threatened to harm me because of a film review in which I did not condemn interracial relationships. That marked the last time in my life I had a listed phone number. I remained oblivious to the dissonance in my own life, the things I had papered over, the hypocrisies and lies I allowed myself in heaping doses. So I think about this a lot. We live in a culture right now that seems to be a little testy. A lot of people fighting a lot, and one of the things that goes back and forth as we talk about what some people call a culture war is one side will say to the other side, oh, you're so woke, you're virtue signaling, and we even are at a point where someone running for president, who has to deal with the fact that he has this past of having said really unfortunate things about people and having them sign NDAs, he says, well, no one can take a joke anymore, which doesn't strike me as the right answer. But the thing is, and I'm just really honing in on myself here, I'm old enough to have lived long enough that there are things I've said and done I really regret. And I'm glad I'm not running for president because they're not likely to come to light. And I might also like to say, oh, they were just jokes. And it makes sense that, for me, if you read my novels, one of the things that you see me wrestling with constantly is how do we judge people for being of their time? And how do we make peace with that? I think that is part of what's going on Lady in the Lake is you're looking at a book set in 1966, and it makes it a little bit easier to look at 66 through the lens of 2020, because we feel like, oh, well, we've grown, we've changed, and I hope we have. But it's something that's I think I start with myself. I'm not worried what anyone else has to say. I know that I haven't been perfect, and there are these stories I know about myself that makes myself squirm, and I don't think I was ever ill-intentioned. No one ever thinks of themselves as a bigot, right? And I was telling people a story the other day about how one time something I wrote in a novel that was in character wasn't me. It was a person on the page that I created. And it created a little kerfluffle up at my publisher, and someone said, well, you need, through my editor said, some people up here find that pretty racist. And I will tell you that it's a really interesting experience when you consider yourself a well-intentioned person to hear someone say that they find you a little bit racist. And what I've come to embrace over the years is the idea that instead of worrying about the labels, worry about what's going on in here. And I try to talk to people about the idea that if you really kind of get yourself set up for some serious introspection, just do what they call naming and noting. Look for some ideas that are floating around in your head that you might not even have noticed. I call them the cockroaches that run when you turn on the light in the kitchen. And here's a really easy way to sort of ease yourself into thinking about, do I generalize about people? Do I ever embrace stereotypes? Like the easy one is, the next time you're driving behind someone on the interstate and they're going super, super slow, and you pass them and you think, I knew they were going to be a much older person. Just think about that. Think about the fact that, oh, I have just availed myself of a stereotype. What's that about? Why do I think that? And I feel sort of like putting yourself on, and if that's going to be called woke or virtue signaling, so have it. I am descended from slave owners. I've known that about myself for a long time. And when I was a reporter, I was asked to interview the man who wrote Slaves in the Family, Edward Ball. And one of the theses of his book is that every slave-holding family, the descendants of slave-holding families, have an essential lie they tell themselves. Because how do you make peace with it? In his family, they said we were good to our slaves. Well, his family ran a rice plantation, and he very quickly found out that there's no way to be nice to people who work on a rice plantation. And I thought, well, what's the lie we tell in my family? And what I had always heard was, there were some slaves in my mother's family, but there weren't very many. So the idea that there are 2 or 3 household slaves. Not that, obviously, 1 is too many, but this was the essential lie. So I went to my mother, who's a librarian, who's done a lot of research into the family tree. And I said, how many slaves did your family have? And she had it, because of course it's on the census, because the slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of the census. My mother's family owned more than 40 slaves. And if you know very much about the history of U.S. slavery, you know that puts them above the 95th percentile of the average Southern household. And my mom had this written on a piece of paper that she gave me, and I kept it in my date book, a date book that was stolen from the back seat of my car in Baltimore, which seems odd. But I wanted to look at it every day and just sort of look at this information and be like, this is factual, this is correct, this is part of your family. And in a weird way, I feel that that has put me in really good stead as people now start sort of wrestling with, who am I, what do I owe, how much privilege do I have? I feel like I got to start on work on that a little bit earlier, and I'm glad for it. I mean, I'm embarrassed, I'm chagrined. I don't know how to talk about it sometimes, but I'm trying to talk about it tonight because it's just a fact. And I feel in owning that fact, that's the best I can do. I don't know how to undo it. When people talk about reparations, I'm always like, well, yeah, if everybody does it. These can become very personal questions, and I don't think any of this is virtuous signaling or being woke. I think sort of coming face to face with your own flaws and the mistakes you've made is just part of living in the world we live in now. And I look back to some of the things I thought and said when I was in my 20s, and I'm like, wow, I really had a lot of entitlement and privilege because I was just so sure of my own goodness. From the moment I crossed the Brazos River and entered Waco, I was scheming to get out. It took 26 months, and it felt like forever. Yet when I look back, I'm struck by how much fun I managed to have, by how many things from Waco I've carried, literally and figuratively, across the decades. I got a lot of anecdotes out of Waco, and writers are suckers for anecdotes. I acquired even more stuff, much of which I still own, much of it from flea markets and yard sales. A hall tree, an antique mirror, 2 salad bowls, a metal Suncrest orange soda thermometer, Fiesta ware, a drop leaf table, a set of dining room chairs, a $15 homemade rocking chair from a stand at the mall. Most of the furniture had to be refinished, a task I chose to do inches from an old-fashioned gas heater in the living room of my second apartment. Honestly, I'm surprised I lived to tell the story. The other stories I have lived to tell include the night my cat caught on fire while sitting next to a candle. He was fine. Going on a rattlesnake roundup with a man named Butch and helping him catch 17 snakes, by which I mean I stood nervously on a rock in my newish cowboy boots and said quietly, "I think I see one there." Falling in love with a San Antonio man, also a reporter, who wanted to steer his car with his knees while playing the harmonica. I covered 2 different cases of matricide in nearby counties. In another homicide trial, I watched a man acquitted of all charges, despite admitting on the stand that he had hid behind a tree and took aim at the head of his wife's former lover. I chased the journey for him from the courtroom, baffled. How would they fail to return at least a verdict of criminally negligent homicide against the man based on his own testimony? "We just don't think the DA made his case," the foreman told me. One of my specialties was interviewing a evangelist, a former heroin dealer who scared Sunday school classes straight, Rick Stanley, famous for being Elvis Presley's stepbrother, Lester Roloff, who ran a notorious school for boys. When I tried to ask Roloff a question about school prayer, he took my hand in his, stared into my eyes, and asked, "Laura, are you a Jew?" I wasn't, only the granddaughter of one, but I put the Star of David on my checks when a woman at the local bank insisted I choose a design for my checkbook. "You gotta have something," she said. "It's free." The only person who ever noticed was the Jewish immigrant who ran the gourmet food shop near my house. I fell in love with the movies, driving regularly to Dallas, 90 miles, or to Austin, 100 miles, to watch old films at revival houses. I subscribed to Film Common and began studying for the GRE, thinking I might enter the film school at UT Austin, take advantage of that sweet in-state tuition. Remember when in-state tuition was sweet? Dating myself. I jumped at the opportunity to be the newspaper's second-string movie critic, especially when the entertainment editor told me I could expense 2 tickets even if I went to the movies alone because I wouldn't be paid for the reviews themselves. That was an extra $5. Money was an issue always. It immediately became apparent I couldn't afford $220 in rent, so I moved to a cheaper, funkier place, the one with the gas heater. For the first 6 months before my pay was raised to $200 weekly, I waited tables at a local Italian restaurant, sometimes serving my boss's wives. I once bought a 25-pound sack of flour because it was so much cheaper by the pound than a 5-pound sack. Mites got to it before I was 3 pounds in. When I learned I needed my wisdom teeth removed, I shopped for the cheapest dentist in town. I had health insurance, but no dental coverage. I opted for a doctor who charged me $40 per tooth over 3 visits with nothing more than Novocaine. On the second visit, the tooth's root was more twisted than the x-ray indicated. This was before AIDS, or at least before anyone in Waco dentistry took precautions to avoid HIV infection. And by the time that tooth was out, the doctor was splattered with my blood and his toupee was askew. On the third and final visit, I burst into tears upon sitting down in the chair, and he gave me a little laughing gas for free. But I don't think my lack of funds was the reason I began to open packages of candy in the supermarket and eat a few pieces, then push the bags back to the rear of the shelf. Brock's chocolate-covered peanuts, M&Ms, any kind of chocolate that wasn't doubly wrapped, because a bag of candy could be fortuitously open and anyone would help herself. That was just normal, whereas only someone with a real problem would unwrap a miniature candy bar. I was on a state highway west of Waco heading to an interview when I heard that Karen Carpenter had died. I have forgotten so much about my life, but I can summon up that scene, that precise moment. It was an overcast February day in Central Texas. I was probably thinking about my love life. I was forever thinking about my love life. My San Antonio boyfriend and I had started discussing whether to strike out for a new city where we might live together. Within a few weeks, he would tell me that he had decided to move to Guatemala, and I cried into my chicken fried steak, which happened to be the first solid food I'd eaten almost in a week. It was in the middle of my wisdom tooth extraction. But on that particular February day, we were still considering moving in together, and I'm sure that was on my mind. Karen Carpenter dead. I hadn't thought about her in ages. I was much too cool for Karen Carpenter, whose records had been my soundtrack in junior high. My taste had migrated to punk and new wave, and because of my San Antonio boyfriend, lots of blues and jazz and conjunto. Initial news reports noted Carpenter had suffered from anorexia, but believed herself cured. It would be several days before anorexia was listed as the cause of her heart failure. This was what an eating disorder looked like to most people in the early 1980s, an extreme case of anorexia nervosa, like the one in the book and the TV movie, The Best Little Girl in the World. Bulimic practices were everywhere. I knew girls at college who vomited and took laxatives, but purging had not yet had its movie of the week, Kate's Secret, much less been entered into the DSM. An eating disorder was life-threatening. Everything else was just, a funny thing you did sometimes, another anecdote. Almost every woman I know made this same joke at least once. If only I could be anorexic for just a few weeks. Years passed before I realized that although I had never crossed the line into a full-out disorder, I was pretty screwed up about food. At the time, I would have simply told you I was hungry. I was always hungry, forever hungry. The bottomless feeling had started in college. There could never be enough food. I wanted pizza and burgers and pancakes. I wanted endless bowls of vanilla pudding from the dorm dining room. I wanted peanut M&Ms and chocolate-covered peanuts and Acme oatmeal chocolate chip cookies and hot fudge sundaes and frozen yogurt with salted peanuts. I didn't know what hunger was, so I didn't know what satiety was. A good friend occasionally grabbed a grape or a cherry as we grocery shopped. I was appalled. I don't think I registered the act as theft, merely unusual, maybe unsanitary. The fruit hadn't been washed. How could you, I would ask my friend. Also, fruit, ugh. Yet not even 2 years later, I found myself wandering Waco's supermarkets after my evening shifts at the newspaper, opening bags of candy, sampling a piece or two, as if stolen chocolate didn't count. I'd then check out with my healthy choices, pita bread, yogurt, cheese. When I was in my early 20s, I was firmly convinced that cheese was healthy and low calorie. One night after work, I indulged in my now habitual foraging and headed to the checkout line. Someone tapped me on the shoulder. I think you forgot something. I turned to see a man in a t-shirt and jeans with a gun on his belt and a badge that he flashed at me. He was strikingly good-looking, too, a Waco Tom Selleck. Yes, I was attracted to the cop who was busting me for stealing food. Meekly, I took the open bag of Brock's chocolate-covered peanuts he pushed toward me. I didn't have enough cash to cover it, not along with my groceries, and I didn't have a credit card. There were no POS terminals for ATM cards in 1981. Luckily, I had that checkbook. I took out one of my Star of David emblazoned checks and wrote the 4 digits required, probably somewhere between $10 and $15. Not even 3 hours earlier, I'd been sitting in my cubbyhole at police headquarters, scanning the day's police reports for possible stories. If I hadn't had my checkbook, I could have ended up in the next day police report, accused of petty larceny. I wish I could tell you that this incident solved everything, but that's not how things work. It would take me almost 30 years for me to find some sanity where eating was concerned. The encounter did, however, put an end to what I now realize was a chronic shoplifting problem. Of all the near misses in Waco, refinishing furniture near the open flame of an old-fashioned gas heater, hunting for rattlesnakes, entrusting my wisdom tooth removal to Waco's cheapest dentist, falling in love, this is the one that I think about the most often. And it is one story in my life I never told anyone, ever. Not a boyfriend, not a husband, not even a therapist, until I wrote this piece. So I kind of fell into this essay writing. It happened about 2 years ago. In publishing, when your book comes out, they have this really great marketing plan, which is they tell you to write a bunch of free stuff for the internet. My father was a journalist, and my father hated writing for free more than anything else in the world. And it is our work, it's like our job. I mean, I hate making stuff up for free so much that I kind of resent playing make-believe with my kid. I'm like, Mama gets paid to make up stories. I don't want to make up a story right now. But more seriously, as I really began thinking about, okay, so if this is the model, if the idea is that you write for a variety of places, I wanted to write for the best places, I wanted to get paid for it, and I really wanted to see what I could do. And with the help of a lot of really cool women, most of whom I met through Twitter, I began placing pieces in places like the New York Times and Real Simple. And I started pretty easy, and I was not, believe me, I was not looking to write personal essays. I love writing fiction. I had never wanted to write a memoir. My sister had asked that I put that in writing, that I would never write a memoir. But all of a sudden, I was sort of interested in this idea of telling certain stories that I felt only I could tell. And it was really not much more than a year ago. It would have been in December of 2018. I was home alone. My husband works in a different city. I'm often alone at night when my kids gone to bed. And I was on the internet reading, there's a forum called Long Reads. And I saw that they had created a new section called Fine Lines, which was for pieces about aging. And I'm like, I'm aging? Who is not? And I'd had a couple glasses of wine. I'll admit, I'm kind of buzzed. And I realized that because the editor of this section follows me on Twitter and I follow her, that I can direct message her. This is like so unprofessional and so inappropriate. And I'm filled with wine bravado. And I'm like, I want to write a piece about this thing about me that's so different from everybody else in the world. And she's like, what is it? I'm like, I am 60 and I have a 9-year-old. And I am always the oldest mom, always, always, always. And she's like, yeah, sure, you can write that. And so I pitched it in December. And then I had no idea what I really wanted to write. And January came and went, and then I just had this February from hell, where it seemed, I'm sure it's an exaggeration now, it seemed as if school closed every other day for some non-weather event. I mean, literally one day, nothing was like, oh, school's closed, so school was closing. It was things like the classic sitcom thing where I found out late on the evening of February 12th that by February 14th, my daughter needed 30 Valentine's Day cards for her class. And then there was, the biggest thing was I couldn't get them to pick up my garbage anymore. And it was just very strange. No one was picking up my garbage all of a sudden. And later I would figure out is that it happened that in front of my house was this dead zone that belonged to no garbage route. And it was there was a truck that went north, and there was a truck that went, and I found this out the day I stood on my doorstep in my bathrobe screaming at a take my garbage! It's not, take! And he finally explained it to me, and I got it. And this ended up with me one day, when they didn't take my garbage, going to the dump with my daughter, and just wanting her to see me as this heroic figure as I heaved my own garbage into a dumpster. And she really did. It was a great... So, I mean, this sounds like a crazy piece, right? It's I'm 60, I've got a 9-year-old, they won't pick up my garbage, my husband's never home because he's making, I was like, my husband, you may wonder where my husband is. He's away, I hope you enjoy your fine cable premium content. And I felt like this is the most specific story in the world. Who else is living like this? And I wrote it, and they ran it right before Mother's Day, and every mom at my school was like, oh my God, I saw myself in that piece. And I was like, wow, I forgot. I forgot this basic lesson of writing, that the more specific you're willing to be, the more universal you'll find yourself. So meanwhile, Long Reads was so delighted, they basically gave me a blank check and said, you can write for us whenever you want. I wrote another piece about body positivity. At that point, my longtime editor said, I think you should be doing a whole book of these. And then I finally wrote a piece that's about how friendships end as we age. And I had one friend ghost me, which just feels so juvenile when you're 60. Also, it took me 18 months to notice. So I was like, so that's how you, and then, well, she doesn't use a lot of social media, so it took me a while. And it was so embarrassing when I found out. What I found out was I realized that her husband had unfriended me on Facebook. And I was like, what's going on? And so I'd lost this one friend, and then I had lost another friend in the most horrible way imaginable, which is that a not mentally well person had walked into the newsroom at the Annapolis Capital-Gazette and shot and killed 5 people, and one of them was Rob Hyacin. He's a really dear friend of mine. He used to sit maybe that far from me at the Baltimore Sun, and was the first person I turned to when my phone rang in October of 1995 and I put it down. I was like, Rob, I just sold my first book. And he said, oh, let's go get coffee and celebrate. So I wrote these pieces, and my editor said, let's do a whole book. And that's how I sort of became this accidental essayist. And I think I've lost some more friends. And my mother and my sister are like, My sister is completely off the hook. She's barely even mentioned in the book, and there's only one essay about my mom, and it's very nice. But they're both a little bit upset that I've been writing essays about my father that they don't think are flattering, and I'm like, well, he's dead. And I think it's okay, because he's not here. I would not be writing some of the things I'm writing about my dad if he were still with us. But so it's like this is something that's completely unplanned. And how delightful as a writer, as a person, to find out that, oh my goodness, there can be still surprises ahead. There's still things to do. And I've really loved the discipline of working on these essays. The book I have coming, My Life as a Villainess, that is the name of a piece I wrote a long time ago and never published, was about some things I learned about myself when I went through my divorce from my first husband and realized, yeah, I'm a crime writer, and now I'm trying to contemplate the fact that in somebody else's story, I'm the bad guy. And it really changed the way I wrote my novels when I had to recognize that I was the villain in someone else's story. I'm like, but I don't feel like a villain. I did what I had to do. And My Life as a Villain is divided into 4 parts. There are the pieces about aging, which are called Game of Crones. There's My Life as a Villain, which has this piece called The Waco Kid, the piece called My Life as a Villainess, and also it has a piece about I got called to the principal's office for the first time at the age of 58 for bad tweets. So that was interesting. And the final section of the book is called Genius, and those are all new essays, but I have a very broad definition of genius. So the essays concern one of my dearest friends, someone I read for years before I got to meet her, a writer named Ann Hood, who's become one of my best friends and is fabulous. An ode to my first babysitter, and this is called Saving Mrs. Banks, because really, if Sarah hadn't come along, my kid doesn't make it to like even age 3, I don't think. There's a piece about my husband's friendship with Tony Bourdain, and what it was like. It's what it's like in general to try to find your place to mourn when so many other people are mourning as well, and how do we deal with celebrity death, and who gets to mourn whom, and who gets to feel the worst. And the final piece in my essay collection is called Men Explain the Wire to Me, which happened because one day on Facebook, a man very earnestly was trying to explain this TV show called The Wire to me, and given that I was there from its inception, I felt like, I have a story to tell that no one else has ever told, and so I'll tell that one too. And so this is the end of The Waco Kid. I decided, I was in the middle of writing this piece, and I was like, I can't finish this piece without going back to Waco. And so in November of last year, I had a chance to go back to Waco. Waco is bigger now, aren't we all? Yet I didn't see that coming. Oh, I knew the population had inched up, that there were new buildings, more development, in part because of the success of the various projects associated with fixer-upper, such as the Magnolia Bakery and the silos. But when I took advantage of a Dallas business trip to visit Waco in November 2019, I was surprised by Waco's scale, how broad the streets are, how great the distances between locations. I was prepared for the changes, caught off guard by what remained the same. I had no plan, just followed my instincts, driving east along 4th Street, pretty sure that I would soon pass the police department, where I once spent 2 nights a week dutifully reading the police blotter. The building is now another city agency, but otherwise unchanged. From there, I turned left on Waco Drive, heading south to see the 2 places I once lived. My old duplex appears to have been converted back to a house. My first apartment, the one I couldn't afford on my $175 weekly salary, is terrifying. A recent makeover to the exterior, which seems to have been inspired by Joanna Gaines's obsession with shiplap, didn't help. I drove north to the newspaper, reliving my old commute. The two-story red brick building was larger than I recalled, and I had completely blanked on the white columns that frame its front door. I turned south on Austin Street, found my way to the Kmart, gone, and the mall. It was when I turned into the mall parking lot that I figured it out. Waco is the generic town that has appeared and reappeared in my dreams off and on for almost 40 years. A squat place in shades of grayish beneath a huge and always overcast sky. These are not nightmares, just busy, mildly stressful episodes. I'm trying to get somewhere, but there are complications. Cars malfunction. I have to detour to pick people up and drop them off. Things aren't where they're supposed to be, but there is a river at the edge of town. The mall, Franklin Avenue, Waco Drive. They're all part of this familiar dreamscape. It's common to project dislike on anyone, anything, with qualities that we dislike in ourselves. In Waco, I saw a place that wanted to be known for goodness, the heart of Texas, the buckle on the Bible Belt, while disavowing its darkness. I pretended to be a good girl and I tried to be a cool girl, but I was neither. I was a boy-obsessed 22-year-old who thought calories consumed while standing up in a grocery store didn't count, and that leaving a ruined bag of candy behind wasn't stealing. Waco is also a good foil. When you live in places where there is explicit racism and otherism, it's super easy to feel great about yourself, to postpone some essential introspection. In my 20s, I believed that I could say and do certain things as long as I did it with kind of ironic self-awareness. I was wrong. Boy, was I wrong. I circled downtown one more time, drove back down Waco Drive, almost got caught in the snarl of Sunday traffic outside the mega church that occupies the side of the grocery store where I once bought a 25-pound bag of flour to save a few bucks. I headed west on 25th Street, far seedier than I remember. I soon came to the old Safeway, boarded up. It appeared to have been vacant for quite some time. A sign on the plywood promised that a supermercado would be coming soon. Suddenly hungry, I tried to go to one of the local places I remembered with affection, Kim's or Videk's, but neither kept Sunday hours. I settled for Taco Cabana, a Texas chain that I fell in love with in San Antonio when there was only one. My San Antonio boyfriend took me there on my first visit in 1982 and instructed me that I must eat a bean and cheese taco because it was the baseline, the taco by which all other tacos would then be judged. At the Waco franchise, I ate a bean and cheese taco in the near-empty restaurant. It was still prime church-going hours, then headed back to Dallas. "Where are you headed?" the Waco kid asked Sheriff Bart at the end of Blazing Saddles. "Nowhere special. Nowhere special. I always did want to go there." He saddles up, rides with the sheriff to the edge of town, then gets in a limousine as the theme song swells. He conquered fear and he conquered hate. He turned our night into day. The song's not about him, but the Waco kid gets a happy ending just the same. One Waco mystery followed me as I drove north on I-35 to Dallas. After I left Waco in 1983, I returned several times over the next few years to visit my friends. At some point, a stray bit of gossip was shared with me. When my name came up, one of the top editors said, I would never be forgiven for what I had done. Whoa, never forgiven. But what had I done? My furtive foraging remained a secret. Had he learned of the expense account I padded, those movie tickets added for my phantom companion so I might have an extra $5 here or there? But I had submitted those expenses with the entertainment editor's benediction, lagniappe for the time and labor I was essentially donating. Did he know I sometimes made long-distance phone calls? Had I forgotten to bring his wife extra rolls and butter when I waited on her during my moonlighting months? Whatever I had done, it must not have tainted me universally. The managing editor tried to hire me when he moved to another paper. The editor with a grudge against me died in 2016, so I guess the story did too. One day I'll be dead, and all my grudges, earned and imagined, will go with me. That's how it works. I was driving a Hertz luxury rental on that sunny November afternoon, a bright blue Chrysler 300. Its radio tuned to a classic rock station that played Air Supply in Chicago. The sort of songs I would have tolerated on the company's car radio as I drove around Central Texas on assignment in the early 80s. I wasn't thinking about boys or food, my long ago preoccupations. I was thinking about endings and how being the Waco kid was probably one of the best things that ever happened to me. I mulled how to end this story. I wanted wise words, profound words, that would show how much I've grown and matured. I remembered Howard Finberg, the journalism prof who dubbed me the Waco Kid, something he probably doesn't even recall. Like Wally Ronkin at the end of Marjorie Morningstar, I realized that the people at whom we yearn to thrust our successes don't really exist anymore. If you can't travel back in time and show them what you went on to accomplish, what's the point? So I guess the only thing left to say is, fuck you, Finberg. And I think we do Q&A now, and Carrie knows what to do. Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering how your experience being a journalist, how that led you into crime writing.
How did my experience being a journalist lead me into crime writing? I was never that much of a police reporter, and I actually began writing about crime more when I became a feature writer, and I happened to sort of be in the right spot at the right time where I'm already trying to write novels, and my newspaper was looking for people who knew how to do what they started calling narrative. And because I was, in my spare hours, trying to write novels, I was kind of developing those chops. The way I started writing crime fiction is that, so the way I broke into writing, which is what I wanted to do all along, and I didn't even remember to tell the story about how when I moved on to my next job in San Antonio, there came a time where I decided I was going to drive to Austin every week to go to this creative writing class, a workshop, just like really kind of a catch-as-catch-can thing that I'd read about in the local newspaper. And it just made perfect sense to me that I would drive an hour and 15 minutes to go to a creative writing workshop. I mean, I used to drive that far to go to the movies. And the teacher happened to be Sandra Cisneros, but it was 1985, so most people knew her, if they knew her at all, only as the author of The House on Mongo Street. And I really wanted to write. I was trying to write these short stories. I read literary fiction. I also read crime fiction, and I loved both. And flash forward to 1991. I went to a party at the home of someone I'd gone to summer camp with. This just came up on the internet yesterday. At summer camp, I had 2 kids in my swim class who have gone on to achieve some things. One is Joseph Weisberg, who's the showrunner who created The Americans. And I was at his premiere last year, and like the head of the network was like, "Are you here because of your husband?" I'm like, "I'm here because I taught him the elementary backstroke." And the other person in that class was Billy Zane. But Joseph's older brother, Jacob, invited me to a party, and I'm there at a party, and I was like, just talking to people, being nice, and this woman I'm talking to says to me, like, out of the blue, she's like, "You're a journalist, do you want to write erotica?" I'm like, what? But she was a very serious woman named Michelle Slung, and she had a contract for an anthology, and she explained that she was looking for submissions, and like the pay was amazing. And after I wrote a story for her that was published under a pseudonym, which I kept from my parents for years, she told me that she thought that I could write a novel, and then she gave me this speech on what she called the mask of genre. And she said a lot of women, when they start to write, they need like something to sort of self-deprecate. So they don't, like, she says, you don't meet a lot of women who sort of like pull themselves up to the computer and say, "Here goes, great American novel coming at you." But women, if they approached writing through a genre, somehow gave themselves permission to do this audacious thing. And I loved crime novels, loved them. I think I love them even more than I love literary fiction because there was like no social approval. Like if you were walking around with like the big thick book of the moment, people would be like, "Oh, you're so smart, that's so interesting." Whereas if you were walking around with Raymond Chandler or James Cain or Carl Hiaasen, who was a writer I loved, and People were like, oh, crime fiction, ugh, genre fiction. So that's really more the reason I went into crime fiction. Journalism, what it did teach me to do, to meet deadlines, to be incredibly professional, and also to just be okay with working badly. I've been going back and forth between a novel in progress and these essays, and it's been hard to switch back and forth like that. And I just finally got my rhythm back because I had to be reminded of something I've known always, which is you have to write bad words before you can write good words. And I was like, okay, let's just write a bunch of bad words. So journalism taught me a lot, but I think I really began doing more crime reporting after I'd already identified for myself this goal of being a novelist. So. Okay. Oh, I see in the back there.
Are you related to Walter Lippman?
Walter Lippman, no. Walter Lippman has two N's. I am the daughter of Theo Lippman Jr., and he had only one N. He was born in Brunswick, Georgia, and his dad was the one who was from Montgomery, and worked at the Atlanta Constitution as a political correspondent, wrote books, and would end up spending most of his career at the Baltimore Sun, where he was an editorial writer and a columnist. He was particularly knowledgeable about presidential politics and the Supreme Court, which were his two areas of expertise. I'm very proud of my dad. My dad was very, very, very funny. One of the funniest people I've ever known.
Well, do you think that you'll revisit Tess Monaghan?
Okay, so now Tess actually shows up in the next novel, but only for one chapter. She turns down the person who's trying to hire her. I've kind of made it hard for myself to go back to Tess. I thought, so I had a small child, and I thought, I haven't read a lot of detective novels about detectives with small children. I think I'll do that. And then I realized, there's a reason they're not a lot of. It's like it creates all these problems. So an interesting thing about Lady in the Lake is that Lady in the Lake, I initially conceived of that as a prequel, and it was going to be about Tess's parents. If you've been reading the Tess novels, in the early Tess novels, there's a character named Spike who runs a bar. And it is known that he committed a felony, which means he cannot have his name on the liquor license. And there's a lot of confusion about which side of the family he's related to and how he came to know Tess's parents. And I sort of said to myself, well, what did Spike do? And I'd like to find out. And when I talked to my editor as a prequel, she made a really smart note, which was that she basically said, does it have to be a prequel? Which is smart because a prequel means that everybody already knows what the ending is in a way. So if I'd done that head on. So for people who haven't read Lady in the Lake, or people who have, there are a lot of Tess Monaghan Easter eggs in there. You meet Tess's mom. Judith is the woman who works in the jewelry store, who becomes friends with Maddie Schwartz, the main character. You meet two of Judith's brothers. This goes real deep. I don't think anyone's picked up on this. If you've read a book of mine called Every Secret Thing, there's a young police detective who comes from a family of Polish police detectives and comes from the Portokurski family. The patrolman in Lady in the Lake who becomes so interested in Maddie, that's actually Nancy's dad. So there were all these Easter eggs hidden in the book. And I want to get back to Tess. It's really hard. And I'm going to find the right case for her eventually, but I haven't yet. I love her, though. I miss her dearly. I mean, it's Tess is my imaginary friend. I think I saw or heard a hand or a voice over there.
I just wanted to thank you for In Bad Trouble. We live in Bandera, Texas. We came all the way from Texas to attend this talk.
Oh, my goodness.
We live in Bandera, and I've shopped in Bernie, so you know all that.
Well, I lived in San Antonio from 1983 to 1989, and one of the other things I get to write about in the essay collection, although it's not really about Texas, but it's got a lot of my San Antonio years in there, and I loved San Antonio. I mean, San Antonio is the kind of place where, after I'd been there about 6 years, it's if I don't leave, I'm never going to leave. it was just so much fun. And I got out, and then the newspaper I worked for, the San Antonio Light, shut down about 2 years later, and most of my friends were out of jobs. We had a reunion in 2018. The years kind of run together, but I think that's right. And I adore Texas, and my goodness, I can't believe you came all the way from Pantera. So, other questions? Okay, I'm going to do the gentleman all the way in the back and then the one in front of him. Okay.
Often they talk about how a writer has to discover their own voice, and that's a turning point for them. When did you discover your own voice, and what novel written by a dead person do you wish you had written?
So I'm still discovering my voice. I will say that early writing, I thought I was going to be James Cain, who is my hero, and I just didn't have that dark of a voice when I started. I published a book in 2018 called Sunburn, which was very much an homage to Cain and The Postman Always Rings Twice, and I can see that my voice, when I want it to be, can be darker. I mean, some of my books, they're no jokes at all. I guess if I could write, I wish I'd written Mildred Pierce. I love the book, Mildred Pierce. I love that novel so much, and it's so interesting to me because the original screen adaptation, which takes enormous liberties with the plot and had to be careful about certain things because of the code, is so much truer to any version that's followed, whether you're talking the Jack Nicholson version or the Jessica Lange version, the Todd Haynes version on HBO, which is so slavishly devoted to the original text, and I should love it, and I don't, but boy, do I love that book. And I love it because it's a crime novel without a murder in it. It's a matter of fact, the crime stakes in Mildred Pierce are pretty low, but it is just, I've never read another book like it. And also, my favorite novel is probably Lolita, but I wouldn't have wanted to write it. And I'll have an essay coming out. I don't even know when the book is coming out. I know I owe my edits by the end of the month. I've been reading and rereading Lolita since I was 12 years old. Now, I read it because I heard it was dirty. It's just, that's just the basic truth. And I'm sorry, yes?
Speaking of your imaginary friends, I've heard authors over the years say that it's almost like they take on a life of their own and they're speaking to you, and then you write stuff, and then you think, where the heck did that come from when you reread it? Have you experienced that?
You mean almost like this kind of automatic writing that happens?
The characters speaking to you and you write it down.
What I find is that if I'm really, really thinking about character, if I'm in character, it's easier to write. And I was writing a very complicated scene today in which the main character is talking to a police officer, and the main character is a novelist, and he might have committed a crime, except he has no memory of it, but he's at the very least now an accessory, and I really got into character, and I was just flying. I was in the airport lounge in New Orleans, and I was sad that I had to go board my plane because I was having such a great morning writing. So, I teach writing. Okay, so this is, every January I go to St. Petersburg, Florida, where Dennis Lehane created a program called Writers in Paradise. And the core faculty, the people who are there every year include Ann Hood, Sturt Onan, Andre Dubus III, Les Standiford, and other people come and go, and we love everybody. And every year I teach there, and I teach in Italy. So it's yes. And I'm always telling people, character drives everything. Character drives plot. Character drives action. If you create full characters and just put them in these situations, it feels almost automatic because you're just logically watching what your character would do. But I'm not completely woo-woo about it. I don't have a lot of woo-woo in me, but I have some though. I'm pretty convinced that the house we own in New Orleans has this really happy ghost who lives there. And it's just like everybody walks over the threshold and is immediately happier than they were. And the other thing I was telling someone I was woo-woo about is I don't believe in horoscopes at all, except mine seems eerily accurate. Oh. One more question. I'm going to go right there. Yes. Yes.
When you read the works of others for your personal enjoyment, have you gravitated to e-books, or do you still rely on the old-fashioned instruments that never need a crash, that never crash and never need a charge?
I prefer physical books. I prefer them. They're not always practical. I have this soapbox that I climb on whenever I'm around anyone at my publishing house who has like power. I mean, like literally the top guy at HarperCollins, I'm like, please, please, please bundle books. I feel like if I buy a hardcover, I feel like I should also get a code to own the digital book. Duh. I consider a physical book superior in every way except for transportation. Like if you're on a trip and you want to carry more than 1 or 2 books. I also love to read in the bathtub. So that's, like a physical book can survive that. And I actually do think that the way I read is different on a tablet. I'm on screens a lot. They make me kind of jumpy. So I absolutely love physical books, and I'm really happy that, reports of their demise were greatly exaggerated. I knew people who 5 years ago were saying books were doomed, publishing was doomed, and they were just wrong. And I think, if anything, I feel like people are reading more, and I actually think that young people are beginning to see that books are a respite from a very jumpy, stress-filled world. And I'm watching my own kid finally become a reader. And it's a beautiful thing. Anyway, I'm going to be over there. And if you didn't get a chance to ask me a question here, ask me when I'm over there. Thank you so much.